Hello friends, today I Kunal Nagpal feel immense pleasure to extend serene greetings of the day to you all pure souls. So, basically my dear friends, I would like to begin today's economic session with the basic philosophical content, that is ego dissolves in love, that is body consciousness dissolves in soul consciousness, and that's really the need of the hour for us to ponder upon and introspect, because in today's global economic situation we are observing that a lot of nations are clashing with each other because of the differences of opinions, which is leading to the clash of interests, and that is resulting into conflict. And that is basically arising out of the body consciousness or ego. So, ego is simply being unnatural pretension, showing something that you are not. It always needs someone else to appreciate and recognize you. Ego is something like, I'm intelligent, I'm like this, I don't like that, I'm ugly, I'm beautiful, etc. So it basically arises out of various prejudices which need to be tackled and which need to be suppressed with unconditional love. I won't say suppression, but I would like to say that needs to be steered. The direction of that particular thought process needs to be changed to unconditional love of belongingness, of brotherhood, and that's the real need of the hour. And that's the real success for creating the paradise. And we all want the paradise, don't we? The reason we have ego is because it is necessary for our growth in life. Ego should be there when there is challenge and creativity. In success, drop your ego, but in failure, hold on to it. That is the positive aspect of ego, and this type of ego is called soul consciousness. So when you think you are failing, the ego says, come on, what is this? Nothing can touch me. And that's called self-esteem. And in the times of failure, we need to motivate ourselves that internal motivation is the secret of success. The I or ego is actually a tiny atom, and when this atomic bomb explodes, it destroys everything. It causes heaviness and discomfort naturally. When this atom, the ego, identifies with the body, it becomes miserable, and that's called as body consciousness. But when it is associated with the spirit, the self, it becomes divine, and that's soul consciousness. It becomes Shakti, that is the energy. In a huge atomic reactor, it is just one atom that has exploded. In the same way, in our body, there is just one atom of I, and when this I explodes, it becomes the light of the self. In Giridhari, Krishna's name Giri means mountain, which is actually ego. And Giridhari lifted the whole mountain with his little finger. This means that even though the ego is like a mountain, but with a little bit of love, you can lift it. Truly beautiful, truly commendable. So the antidote for ego is just being natural like a child, that innocence, that purity, that soul consciousness. So be in unconditional love, and then ego automatically disappears. Isn't it beautiful, dear guys? That's really very, very heart touching, and that's really the need of the hour. We need to introspect upon it in order to realize that we are worthy of creating the paradise. And now let's begin with today's economic session. And this morning briefing with which we have begun our today's session would be the basis of all the economic news we are going to ponder upon today. So here it goes. The first news highlight is Brexit has left UK's economy 5.5% smaller. Brexit has left the UK economy 5.5% smaller than it would have been and added to the squeeze on public services that's behind the strikes crippling the railways and National Health Service, a research group said. Innovate Responsibility. On 19th December 2022, during his visit to India, Mr. Sundar Pichai underlined that Alphabet and Google want to be a responsible and constructive partner in the Digital India mission and drive innovation in a responsible regulatory ecosystem. Now, let's discuss the basic news of how COVID hit economies. In many developing economies, the additional tax revenue is needed to meet the growing demands for the public goods and services and support the developmental goals. In many developing economies, additional tax revenue is basically needed to meet the growing demands for public goods and services and support the developmental goals. An estimate suggests that achieving the sustainable developmental goals, that is the set of 17 SDGs in key areas, requires additional spending by 2030 of nearly $0.5 trillion for the low-income developing countries and $2.1 trillion for the emerging market economies, and India is one of the main emerging market economies. In this study, we focus on developing the economies in Asia and estimate the short-run and long-run association between the tax revenue and output with panel and time series analysis. The panel results suggest that both short-run and long-run tax buoyancy coefficients are above 1. We then apply the regression coefficients to obtain the estimates of revenue loss because of the COVID-19. Specifically, we first estimate a time series model with 1998 to 2019 data. We then compare the model predictions of revenues from 2015 to 2020 with actual data in order to assess the impact of the COVID-19 over and above what would normally be expected given the GDP downturn. We find that the tax revenue fell more than the model's predictions in many economies, while in a few economies, predicted actual revenues are very close. The averaged and GDP weighted across 24 economies, the estimated excess revenue loss of developing Asia amounted to minus 0.5% of COVID-19 of the 2019 GDP in 2020. From how do tax revenues respond to the GDP growth? Evidence from Developing Asia 1998 to 2020, Asian Development Bank. Companies fret over the ripple effect of new COVID wave in China. The new surge in COVID cases in China is actually making the Indian companies, from electronics and apparel manufacturers to gold and diamond exporters, worried about another bout of supply chain disruptions as well as exports to the Chinese market getting hurt. And dear friends, on this note, I would also like to bring to your notice that the rally of Bharat Jodo Yatra going on by Mr. Rahul Gandhi has been asked to stop because of the rising COVID cases in India. Next, the private cryptos can cause a financial crisis. If the cryptocurrencies are allowed to grow, they would cause the next financial crisis. The RBI Governor, Mr. Shaktikant Das, warned on Wednesday. According to Mr. Das, the RBI views the private cryptocurrencies as a 100% speculative asset that should be actually prohibited. And the government restarts random testing for international passengers as the COVID cases rise worldwide. The decision basically comes after India detected the cases of Omicron subvariant BF.7, the strain behind fresh spurt in the COVID cases in China. Earlier in the day, the Union Health Minister reviewed the situation in the country and asked the people to follow COVID appropriate behavior, including wearing masks in the crowded places and get vaccinated. Now, here comes a very important economic insight by Dr. Nirmala Sitharaman, who states that India won't exceed the financial year 2023 fiscal deficit target. The Finance Minister, Dr. Nirmala Sitharaman, said the government won't breach the financial year 2023 fiscal deficit target as there is enough revenue buoyancy to meet the additional expenditure. Dr. Sitharaman said there has been a pickup in the private sector investment and the center's targeted approach to deal with the impact of COVID has actually helped revive growth, steering clear of the threat of recession. The government is keeping a close watch on inflation in order to ensure there is no price surge. Dr. Sitharaman told the Rajya Sabha in her reply to the discussion on the first batch of the supplementary demand for the grants for the financial year 2023. The Rajya Sabha approved the demand authorizing the government to spend an additional 3.25 lakh crore rupees in the financial year 2023. She also made a case for transparency in subsidies, responding to the debate on freebies. The supplementary demand for the grants is basically essential to meet the expenditure on food and fertilizer subsidies and provide support to the economy, farmers and the poor, she said, responding to the concerns raised by some members about the size of the amount. There is actually enough revenue buoyancy, which gives me confidence that we will fund this supplementary demand without breaching the fiscal deficit target, Dr. Sitharaman said. In September itself, the government made it clear that we are not changing our borrowing schedule and borrowing plans. The government has budgeted a fiscal deficit of 6.4% of GDP of the current fiscal year. The higher tax collections have allowed the center to absorb the additional spending on food, fuel, and fertilizer subsidies. Dr. Sitharaman said the government is keeping an eye on inflation, which is purely extraneous currently on account of global fuel and fertilizer prices. Now let's discuss the aspect of growth and capex. Dr. Sitharaman noted that the private sector capital expenditure is taking place because of the policies of the government, such as production-linked incentive scheme. The private sector capital expenditure announcements are up 35% year on year and 53% above the pre-COVID levels, she said, citing a report by an equity research company. PLI is seeing an absolutely robust response from the industry. Dr. Sitharaman said, 14 sectors have been given the PLI and that is drawing a lot of investments to the country. The government's policies have developed and have helped revive the economy, she said. Because of the targeted approach in which the government decided to give the relief during COVID and address the concerns given as the inputs from various stakeholders, it has kept India on the safe course of revival and also not getting into recession, she said. That's truly commendable, truly commendable. Now let's discuss the aspect of freebies. The finance minister observed that subsidies and freebies should actually be contextualized, making it a case for pure transparency. If you are able to put it in your target, make the provision for it. No one will have any type of objection, she said, adding that education, health, and farm subsidies are justified. All we want is pure transparency and compliance with the fiscal rules. Dr. Sitharaman said the Narendra Modi government basically focuses and works on the principle of development of all and appeasement of none. That is, we believe in Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Our schemes like Jan Dhan, Jam Trinity, PM Ayushman, Ujjwal, Ujala, PMGKAY, etc., which benefit the common people, are these meant for the corporates? She asked during her reply. Dear friends, I find this truly very, very articulative, and this in depth analysis is very, very insightful. Now, let's now discuss the aspect of inflation versus growth divide and how it is widening over the rate trajectory. So, this has been given by our RBI Governor, Mr. Shaktikant Das. The two constituent blocks of the Monetary Policy Committee at India's central bank appear to be on slightly different tracks on the appropriate policy stance for the immediate future, with the panel's external members signaling the need for a pause in the interest rate increases, even as the Mint Road counterparts favored continuing with an approach that puts inflation restraint ahead of any other goal. The external members believe that the worsening economic conditions influenced by the global slowdown and past rate increases since early summer require the MPC to pause and assess the conditions before continuing on the path of further rate tightening. Minutes of the last MPC show. But the RBI brigade, led by the governor, Mr. Shaktikant Das, is of the view that lowering the guard at this point may actually cause the central bank to trail the curve, as it were, if inflation remains stubbornly above the target level. Hence, the in-house MPC members seem to be in favor of a stance that envisages pushing the rates higher. So considering the elevated inflation levels, especially the stickiness in core inflation, further calibrated monetary policy action is warranted to contain a build-up in underlying inflationary pressures, keep inflation expectations anchored, and bring inflation closer to the target of 4% over the medium term, the Governor Das told and wrote in the minutes. There is no room for the complacency, and the battle against inflation is not over. This basically necessitates a constant vigil on the prices. The MPC this month voted for a smaller 35 basis point rise in the repo rate to 6.25%, its fifth increase this year, as inflation, thought initially to be transient, turned sticky. Now, here I would like to state a basis point is actually 0.01 percentage point. So, it is not in a lockstep. The central banks across the world are raising the rates very sharply and very peakily, and talking about the need to persist with tight monetary policy to contain inflation at a 4-decade high. By contrast, the Indian policy makers believe they need not mimic the US Federal Reserve or the Bank of England with the pace of rate tightening, although the broad policy direction has not differed from what's being followed by the central banks on either side of the Atlantic. Much of the impact of this large front-loaded monetary policy action is yet to be felt in the real economy, said Mr. J.R. Verma, an independent member of the MPC and a professor of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. I believe that 6.25% itself very likely overshoots the repo rate needed to achieve the price stability and poses an unwarranted risk to the economic growth. India's inflation has been above the 4% target and has remained above the upper tolerance band of 6% over the 3 quarters in a row, forcing the central bank to give an explanation to the center on the breach and the steps being taken to remedy the breach. Pricing pressures may be easing due to tightening, but these are the concerns which need to be addressed, like the potential second order effects. So reversing the trajectory row could actually cause a price spiral again. So are these actually the premature celebrations? Should the incoming information indicate that the recent small easing of inflation is transient rather than the onset of a durable downturn? The MPC should be prepared to respond appropriately in order to achieve the desired inflation objective. Deputy Governor Mr. M.D. Patra wrote in the minutes, MPC needs to see the decisive decline in inflation over a series of monthly readings before it shifts the stance, which would otherwise be premature. So, what are the main policy points? The Governor Das in minutes said, further calibrated monetary policy action is warranted in order to contain a build-up in underlying inflationary pressures, keep inflation expectations anchored, and there is no room for complacency. And external members believe the worsening economic conditions influenced by the global slowdown and the post-rate increases require the MPC to pause and assess the conditions before further rate tightening. Now, on this note, my dear friends, I would like all of you to ponder upon and analyze that who is basically correct in his or her approach. That is the Governor Das in MPC minutes, who has stated and how he is justifying the rate increases and how he is paying emphasis over the aspect of inflation in order to make it below the band of 6%. And what do the external members believe? That the worsening economic conditions influenced by the global slowdown and the past rate increases, who believe that the MPC should pause and assess the conditions before further rate tightening. So I wish all of you to ponder upon that who is actually correct in approach for dealing with the current situation, considering the overall scenario of the Indian economy and how it is functioning in the global slowdown. Next, my dear friends, let's discuss the views of the FICCI president, who basically states that attract global supply chains in order to expand the PLI schemes to spur manufacturing. He states that India needs to attract the global supply chains, expand the scope of production-linked incentives, extend lower corporate tax of 15% for 5 years, and continue improving the ease of doing business to spur manufacturing. And he believes that the government is putting in best efforts to reduce the cost of doing business. So, my dear friends, this is all about today's economic session, and I believe that all of you would ponder upon the topics we have discussed and express your views in the comment section so that we can analyze your points which need to be incorporated for further modifications in order to strategize our discussions in a more appropriate manner, because your feedback is really very, very valuable for us. Thank you so much, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel for getting updated with the fresh economic insights on regular basis. Thank you so much. A lot of regards to all of you. Jai Hind.